Hello, everybody. I'm Aaron Porras, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, the chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hello, Professor Dershowitz. It's nice to be working with you again. Good to see you.
Thank you. Likewise.
All right, now, Professor, let's get started. Our guest today is Ruthie Bloom. She's a veteran journalist, columnist for Israel Hayom and the Jerusalem Post, and the current editor for the prestigious Gatestone Institute. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Now, Professor, you've spoken very frequently on our program and in many media appearances all over the world about using the criminal justice system to achieve political goals, especially when it comes to United States President Donald Trump and also here in Israel. So, Ruthie, I know you also feel strongly about this subject. Would you please open our dialogue today with Professor Dershowitz? Take it away.
Happily. Professor Dershowitz, you know, you've written extensively about this subject, the issue of litigating instead of trusting the ballot box, let's say, if I'm paraphrasing correctly. In the United States right now, we have a situation where the president is under heavy investigation, and in Israel as well, the prime minister is under heavy investigation. And you have argued that this makes it very difficult for leaders to lead, and that what we should do is wait till they're out of office and then deal with the legal issues. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Well, thank you so much. I, of course, have elaborated on it on my forthcoming book called Trumped Up, how the criminalization of political differences endangers democracy. I've been making this point since Yitzhak Rabin was forced out of office because his wife had a small bank account in the United States. Rabin was democratically elected. They should have waited until the end of the term, and if they wanted to charge somebody, they could have done that, or until he left office by a vote of lack of confidence. I've made the same point in America over the years. I made it when Congressman Tom DeLay was falsely accused, when Senator Stevens, Senator Bob Menendez, and now, of course, the big whales that Captain Ahab of Moby Dick are going after, namely President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, both popularly elected through the Electoral College, through the system of elections in Israel. And now efforts are being made to force them out of office and make it difficult for them to govern by using the criminal justice system. It's a terrible attack on a democracy. It's also a very grave attack on civil liberties because it requires expanding criminal statutes beyond the way they were intended and using them to target individuals. You know, it was Lavrenti Beria, the notorious head of the KGB, who told Joseph Stalin, "Show me the man and I'll find you the crime." If you target somebody, if you're determined to find crimes on the basis of Donald Trump, his son-in-law, his aides, or Prime Minister Netanyahu, his wife, his son, you know, you're going to find a tray of food here and there that may have been accidentally misused, or an excessive acceptance of a couple of bottles of champagne or some cigars. You're going to find it. As a friend of mine wrote in a very, very well-received book a few years ago called 3 Felonies a Day, you can find that an average of 3 felonies every day that businessmen and people who are in complicated relationships commit. The purpose of the criminal law is to use judgment and use precedent. And these criminal actions that are being directed against both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are never used against ordinary people in this way. And it poses great dangers to use the criminal law selectively in an effort to do legally what you haven't been able to accomplish politically.
Right. Well, may I play devil's advocate for a moment and
Sure.
ask you whether there's nothing positive about the fact that in a democracy it is possible to imprison our leaders. For example, if you take Turkey, Israel's neighbor, there you have a president who imprisons the judges and the police and doesn't enable, or the media doesn't enable any kind of criticism.
And actually, I'd like to, if I may, I'd like to even add to that. How then would you suggest we go about getting rid of leaders who are grossly negligent or grossly criminal in their actions? You know, how do we go about finding those things out? Is it really an issue with the media, you know, making things public before we have any true facts on the ground, or is there something else there?
Oh, every democracy has mechanisms for putting their leaders out of office. In Israel, the mechanism is quite simple. In America, it's complex. In America, it requires impeachment, which is a majority vote by the House of Representatives and 2/3 vote of the Senate. It's only been tried really 3 times. In Israel, there's a much easier mechanism, simply a vote of non-confidence by the Knesset. Those are the mechanisms that are in place. And those require democratic actions by popularly elected people. But what's going on now involves one person. Mueller, who is the special counsel, can bring about the end of the Trump administration. And in Israel, the attorney general, who's a great man, a man of great distinction, who I've known for years, can bring about, realistically, the end of the Netanyahu administration if Netanyahu were to accept the tradition of resigning if he were to be indicted. I hope he's not indicted, and I hope if he is indicted, he doesn't resign, because I think it's a mistake to resign based on an accusation rather than on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But every country that's a democracy has mechanisms for removal. Turkey, on the other hand, has no mechanism for removal. There's no democratic way, there's no political way of removing Erdogan, just like there's no political way of removing Putin or removing some of the other leaders who have abused trust. But both Israel and America have political alternatives, and that's why the criminal justice approach should not be used, or should be used only in extreme cases. Obviously, what I'm saying does not apply to somebody who's committed treason or bribery. And our Constitution says treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. But when we're talking about relatively trivial and arguable offenses that have never been brought before, those are not the ways to undo the democratic election. And, you know, our countries, both of our countries, have become so partisan that when I support the right of Donald Trump to be accused only of crimes if he's committed criminal conduct, I'm accused of being a Trump supporter. I'm not a Trump supporter. I voted for Hillary Clinton. And the points I'm making in Israel are not because the prime minister happens to be Netanyahu. I made the same points about Rabin. I've made the same points about Olmert, the same points about Sharon. And I would make the same point about anybody who is being challenged based on the kinds of criminal allegations that are now in the air against Netanyahu and against Trump.
I'd also like to ask you if you see this issue on both sides of the political spectrum. At the moment, what we're seeing is a heavily, let's say, left-wing media and, you know, the anti-Trump crowd. There are also conservatives who are anti-Trump, of course. And in Israel, there are conservatives who are anti-Netanyahu. But for the most part, what we're seeing is a kind of general atmosphere coming from the left. However, I'd like to ask is if you've seen this same kind of attempt to oust political opposition from the right.
Of course. And if Hillary Clinton had been elected, which I was hoping would happen, if she had been elected, we'd see the right wing today saying, lock her up, investigate her emails, reopen the investigation, look into the Clinton fund, go back to her husband's problems. Of course, we'd be seeing the same thing. Both sides use that tactic because it's so easy. And you can work with friendly media. If you're conservative, you work with Fox News. If you're liberal, you work with MSNBC. It's interesting. I was on MSNBC the other night, and I was being interviewed by a very, very biased a journalist who reminded me of the person in Israel who interviewed me. And they both asked me the same really rude, impertinent, and improper question. The Israeli journalist asked me whether I was being paid by Prime Minister Netanyahu to make these points. And the MSNBC journalist asked me if I was being paid by Donald Trump. Of course, that's absurd. And the newest twist is when I make points, legitimate points, I'm accused of being a racist by Congresswoman Maxine Waters and others because I've said something they might disagree with about the jury pool in the District of Columbia being more favorable to the prosecution than the jury pool in Virginia would have been. That's just an observation that every criminal lawyer would agree with. but suddenly I'm being called a racist. The point is that we don't have reasoned arguments in either of our countries anymore. We have name calling, we have criminal, criminal, criminal. Everybody's crying wolf. And when real crime is committed, we've diluted the concept. When real racists come forward, we've diluted the concept. Let me give you another example. The Jewish Daily Forward wrote the most despicable article I have ever seen written by a Jewish newspaper. And that's a very low threshold considering Haaretz. But it was a remarkable piece. It talked about the 19 or so people that Jews have to fear more than Linda Sarsour, who's, of course, a supporter of terrorism. And among the people it listed were, of course, the head of Hamas. That's true. The head of Hezbollah. That's true. The leader of Iran, David Duke. And then they throw in Mort Klein, the president of the Zionist Organization of America. Now, Mort and I disagree about a great many things, but to list him among people who want to see the end of Israel, who want to see the end of Jews, who would like to return to the days of Nazism, to list a Zionist like Mort Klein and to list the Zionist Organization of America without, for example, listing the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a virulently hard left, anti-Zionist and often anti-Semitic organization. Shame on the Forward. You know, the Forward had invited me to write an article, and I was about halfway through writing it. But when I saw what they published in their pages, I withdrew it and said I would not any longer publish for a newspaper that engaged in that kind of obscene comparison between Mort Klein on the one hand and murderers of Jewish children on the other hand. Shame on the Forward. But it shows you where we've come in the divisiveness among Jews, and the divisiveness between liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. We are in a very, very sad state when it comes to politics in both of our countries today.
Now, Professor, I'd like to move on to more regional politics here in the Middle East. We're seeing reports that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are on the edge of reaching a reconciliation deal. What would that mean for Israel, in your opinion?
Well, we've seen that headline how many times in the last 10 or 15 years. It depends on the nature of the reconciliation. If Hamas is prepared to accept the principles of recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, if Hamas is prepared to end terrorism, if it's prepared even to go as far as the Palestinian Authority has gone. They haven't recognized Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, but they've recognized Israel's right to exist, at least in form, and they have taken some efforts to stop terrorism, a mixed bag. But if Hamas would become the Palestinian Authority, I think it would be a good thing. But if it moves the Palestinian Authority more toward accepting Hamas's position that murdering Jewish children is an acceptable form of protest for a non-occupation, because after all, Hamas is not occupied. The occupation of Gaza ended many years ago, and Gaza could have been the Singapore in the Mediterranean had it used the money it got from Europe and the farm equipment left over by Israel to build a decent society, but instead it used everything to build rockets and terror tunnels. So it really depends on the nature of the rapprochement. It could be good news or it could be bad news.
Professor Dershowitz, speaking of Hamas, Hamas has also been growing closer to Iran of late, and
right.
There has been a lot of, Iran has been very proudly publicizing that fact. And in the meantime, we are now seeing that North Korea seems to have perfected a small nuclear warhead for ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles, and there is definitely a connection between North Korea and Iran, which means that Israel right now has Iran basically sitting on its northern border and perhaps on its southern border as well, and North Korea by extension. Do you see do you see any way that the Trump administration and the Netanyahu administration, both under all these investigations, can deal with this great threat right now?
Well, that's why I think that both Netanyahu and Trump's political enemies ought to let them govern. This is a very critical time. We're seeing changes in the world. I mean, the relationship between Iran, which is Shia, and Hamas, which is Sunni, it's really the first break in many ways in the Shia-Sunni dichotomy, the first rapprochement between a Sunni and a Shia group. I guess the enemy of your enemy suddenly becomes your friend, and the North Korea Iran combination with America making the mistake of allowing Iran to have a presence in Syria on Israel's northern border. This is a time for diplomacy. This is a time for consideration of what military options or threats might be available. This is not a time to be worrying about champagne, cigars, or the firing of the head of the FBI. This is a time for elected political officials to be doing their job, and it's a very, very difficult job. We're seeing all kinds of realignments now. There's pressure on Qatar to stop its support for Hamas as Iran increases its support for Hamas. We're seeing the President of the United States threatening North Korea. I would like to see the President of the United States also make a statement about Iran and read the preliminary statement to the agreement, which says Iran reaffirms that it will never, under any circumstances, seek to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. The President of the United States ought to announce that that is American policy, that we accept that part of the agreement as much as the sunset provision of the agreement. And in fact, it overrides the sunset provision of the agreement because it uses the word never, never, never. Iran will never, under any circumstances, seek to acquire, develop nuclear weapons. And American policy and Israeli policy already is, but American policy ought to be that America will never allow Iran, no matter how many years go by, to acquire or develop nuclear weapons. It will take whatever steps, including military steps, are necessary. I'd like to see Congress authorize the president to take military action to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons even after the agreement is ended. But so far, that hasn't yet happened.
So to that effect, you were talking about the president making clear our position, our foreign policy when it comes to Iran, and that they are very much against terrorism. We see that also with the Tailor Force Act that I want to get into in a little bit. But why is it then, do you think, that the United States and Russia were so willing to ignore Israel in what we've reported today were secret talks between Israel, Russia, and the United States over Syria?
I'm disappointed, and I'd like to know more about it. It seems to me that when it comes to Syria, Israel must play a central role because it's going to protect its northern border. The last time I was in Israel with my granddaughter, we took a helicopter ride over the Golan, and there's no better way of seeing how close the fighting is and how close Hezbollah is and how close really Iran is. We know that Israel, whether deliberately or inadvertently, did kill Iranian officers who were too close to the border, and we know that where there is Iran, there is Hezbollah. So Israel should have been included and should now be included in any discussions about Syria, particularly about the military presence of Hezbollah or Iran anywhere near the Syrian border, or the military presence of Russia near the Syrian border as well. So Israel has to be kept in the loop because it has the right to defend its northern border as it has the right to defend all of its borders.
Well, we heard lots of reports about Netanyahu meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin and coming to an arrangement with him about Syrian airspace, saying that, after all, Putin was on Iran's side, but he said he had no interest in allowing Hezbollah to bring weapons, to use weapons against Israel, and therefore he seemed to have been keeping that promise to allow Israel to operate over Syria without shooting down any Israeli planes. Do you think that those kind of back channels, I would say, maybe are better than the official ones?
Well, we need both. Obviously, you need back channels. You need to have conversations with leaders. That's why it's, again, very important not to undo current politically elected leadership and create uncertainty. With Netanyahu, the world knows what it's getting. It's seen Netanyahu for so many years. If Netanyahu were to be replaced, which would be very undemocratic and I think a tragedy for the current situation in the world, who knows who would be replacing him? Who knows what the relationship would be with Russia, with the United States, with the Palestinian Authority, with Egypt, with Jordan? This is not a time for unknowns to replace knowns. And therefore, it's another very important reason for the Israeli law to be changed and to allow criminal prosecution based on usual criminal prosecutions after a prime minister has left office, but to not allow judicial officials or prosecutorial officials to determine who serves in office, except in extreme cases. And I don't think anybody would argue that we've approached that line of extreme cases with the allegations that are currently being made by the media and by selective leaks against Prime Minister Netanyahu.
All right. Now, as I mentioned before, I wanted to discuss the Tailor Force Act a little bit. Now, the Tailor Force Act, as I'm sure you know, but for our viewers, is a bill currently being passed or on the books where the United States wants to cut a very large portion of the funding to the Palestinian Authority until they stop paying terrorists or the families of terrorists, so-called martyrs. Now, President Trump's team and the White House administration are saying that they will support the act, but as long as it doesn't interfere with the prospects of an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. Now, from the Palestinian Authority's perspective, they're paying freedom fighters. So in what way does this act not, get into the middle of things?
Well, I think the United States rejects the concept, appropriately so, as does the entire, really, Western world, that people who murder children, who come in the middle of the night and stab a family, are freedom fighters. Freedom fighters fight against the army, fight against military targets, not against children and old people and hospitals and other civilian institutions. Those are called war crimes, and they're being committed on a daily basis by Israel's enemies. And the United States is perfectly right in seeking to cut off payment to the family of war criminals. Whether or not this will have an impact on the peace process is a subtle and difficult issue. And I think reasonable people could disagree about whether the Palestinian Authority should now have funds revoked if it's providing security for Israel in its attempt to stop terrorism. I mean, obviously, the Palestinian Authority is playing a double game. On the one hand, it is helping Israel to a degree in stopping terrorist activities. On the other hand, it's rewarding terrorist activities after they occur, thereby incentivizing them and encouraging them. It's a kind of schizophrenic approach that I have personally discussed with President Abbas and with Saeb Erekat and with others. But it's untenable for the future for the Palestinian Authority, on the one hand, to be trying to stop terrorism, and on the other hand, rewarding and incentivizing terrorism by the payment of these large proportions of its budget to the families of murderers of children.
Ruthie, how do you respond? What do you think about this?
Well, I think the Tailor Force Act is a great bill on paper, because there's nothing better than calling the Palestinian Authority to task for rewarding terrorists by paying them a salary that's higher than their annual salary that they would make in any job. On the other hand, I think that there's going to be real difficulty in, even if it does pass, in implementing it, because to monitor the Palestinian Authority when it has all kinds of ways of laundering the money and channeling it, funneling it, saying, no, this will go to a hospital when it doesn't, in fact. That's a much trickier prospect. But also, I think that without such a bill, you can't have a peace process. There's no way to have a peace process with an entity that is sworn to your destruction and rewards it.
All right, well, on that note, I think it's a good time to end. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for your time, Professor Dershowitz. I also want to thank our guest, Ruthie Bloom, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And now, if you'd like to ask Professor Dershowitz a question, go to our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week.